actually Meyer's scornful dog of scorn, who watches the proceedings in the fencing illustrations, thinking, I wouldn't have done it like that. Yeah.
The recording is going, by the way.
Right. Okay, well, welcome everybody to my class on an introduction to Meyer's longsword. This is not the whole thing. It's not even remotely near. This is enough to get you started. If you have an interest in looking further, I strongly recommend two books by Meyer. This one, which is translated by Geoffrey Forgang and comprises Meyer's printed work, and this one, which is also translated by Forgang and comprises a manuscript version that predates the printed one. And they're slightly different. We'll get a little bit into this. So, why is it not behaving itself? Joachim Meyer, 1537 to 1571. Well, we think 1537. There was a Joachim Meyer baptized in Basel, where we know he was from, in 1537, but it's not the rarest of names, so probably. He married in to become a burgher of Strasbourg, and actually worked as a cutler, knife maker. Fencing was a side gig that he was trying to get into properly. So his Gründlichen Bescheidung des Kunstfechten was printed in 1570, left him heavily in debt, and he spent some time hawking around, trying to find a rich patron, basically, but in the process of which he caught a fever and died. He is not to be confused with Meyer, M-A-I-R, who was also a German 16th century fencing master who left an impressive book, but who embezzled his city's funds to do it and got hung for his troubles. So where does the art of combat fit? That's the Kunstfechten, but I'm going to spare you my German accent and call it the art of combat. It's basically the last manual on a long series of German fencing manuals, primarily of the longsword or longsword and other weapons. So the first one is Lichtenauer, but the famous one is Talhofer, and it goes on. There are some specialists who branch out a bit. So most of the fencing manuals derive a chapter from the works of Ott Jud, Ott the Jew, who was a wrestling master. Now, by 1570, longsword is not militarily relevant anymore, but it is being taught for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it is a manly sport for manly men with manly beards and big trousers, and very German and so on. Secondly, Meyer uses the longsword as a couple as the foundation of the other weapons he deals with. However, if you're teaching a thing which is a manly sport for manly German men, you don't want to be taking too many risks. So Meyer does make some compromises in technique. So the primary one is he does not use thrusts at all with longsword. And that means that some of the guard positions are less relevant than they are in our context. And the second thing, in our context, we have to insert the thrusts back in, or at least if you're using it in steel combat rather than armored, you have to. Additionally, because you're no longer actually using a sword that's at least partly for chopping through pike hafts, you don't need to muck around with it being super heavy and super thick anymore. So you have a narrowing of the weapon. Typically, I vanish if I try and demonstrate it. We'll get to it later. So you have narrowing of the blade into what's called a feather. So we have the two surviving works, Kunt Defechten, which is what got printed, and the Lunt manuscript, which only covers longsword, dusak, and rapier. To learn Meyer's other techniques, you really need to have a basic grounding on his longsword, because he goes longsword, dusak, rapier, pole weapons, dagger, and wrestling. And each section is shorter than the one before, because he assumes a certain level of knowledge and techniques will be transferable. So one thing I'm doing as a very sporadic A&S project is I am training Duke Elf into fence. And we are doing it from the 1570 Meyer manual. So we are working through longsword, and when we are both happy with that, we'll move on to Messer as a dusak equivalent you can actually use, and only then rapier, and then he's going to teach me pole weapons from it. So watch this space. Meyer is a lot about timing. So he describes the concepts of vor, the before, gleich, simultaneous, and nach, after. So if, for example, His Majesty and I were about to swing at each other, and he's faster than me, so he would be attacking in the vor, and I would be having to respond in the nach. And the central aim is to acquire the vor, push your opponent into reacting, and keep clobbering him so he never has time to do it properly, essentially. There are also a couple of other timings, gleich, which is simultaneous, and what he describes as indes, instantly, in the moment, where you see a fleeting, momentary opportunity and you throw a shot at it without active thought. And those of you who are used to fencing against people who are old and grey and slow will possibly have experience of being offered things that aren't really there. So I would just issue a slight caution about acting on reflexes on the index. He also doesn't talk about true edges and false edges as we classically have. He talks about the long edge, which is if you're, here's one I prepared earlier, holding your sword, this is the true edge in line with your knuckles. The false edge, the short edge, is the other one. So that's the terminology he uses. He carefully defines foible and various other bits and pieces, but doesn't actually use them very much in the book, so I've skipped that. The other thing you need to get in your head is that he doesn't talk usually about guards the way somebody coming from Italian rapier would. So a guard is somewhere where you're comfy sitting while waiting for your opponent to do something stupid. Not for Meyer. A guard is a position held in a moment of time. You might mentally think of this as a flick book, you know, the little books that you draw with a cartoon character on each page. And as you flick through the book, the character moves. Well, a guard is one of those pictures. So this is a position you hold in passing, usually. He separates from the older German techniques, masters who defined primary guards and secondary guards and master strokes as being different things. Meyer sort of lumps them all a bit in together. I've kind of split it back out a bit because I originally learnt Longsword from older books. So it's kind of how I think about them. However, the big advantage for Meyer is he describes them a lot more clearly than some of the other sources. I think I've got a lot of things on the chat. So let's have a little bits. Not worth having if one is a manly German man. Oh, yes, enormous trousers. Yes, very enormous trousers, definitely. So holding the sword suggestively, yes, sometimes. Regarding thrusting, yeah, no, I have to say I don't agree with the concept that Meyer thrust. There's just nothing mentioning it with the longsword. Are the swords based on a curved sword? Possibly. The Messer, the knife, had a much longer true edge than the short edge and had a slight curve on it. But mostly it was only sharpened halfway up the back edge. So that may be why long edge and short edge. Okay, so just close that bit back off. Does he parry? Not hugely. So some guards will let you stop an incoming attack and then launch one of your own. So what we would consider a parry. The classic one is one that he kind of doesn't mention hugely, called crown, where you thrust the sword up so it forms a crown across your forehead. I may have to shut that virtual background off, mightn't I? Virtual background, none. So you're throwing it up like that. So the hilts form a crown across your upper head, and it catches a blow coming down on either oblique. from whence you can do nasty things. However, that's not his preference. He also describes some cuts where you cut into a particular guard to divert the other person's attack and then separately launch one of your own. But what he says you should aim for is the perfect guard where you cut into your opponent's attack and it stops his attack and lands your own with the same attack. Because, you know, obviously that's both ideal and also so easy to do, isn't it? So this is going to be the point. It might be useful for you to pick up your swords/sword analogues. Now, the first of the primary guards is ox, which thankfully sounds the same in German and English, so I can pretend to be pronouncing whichever one I prefer. You can form this either left or right, depending on which side of the body it's in. The illustration is of a right ox. So you point your left foot forward. With right ox, your forearms cross like that, pointy end towards the other guy. You're going to catch a downward cut to that side on your hilt or forte, so near your hands, and then you are going to be in a position to either thrust or cut out of it into the other ox and do unpleasant things, or into another guard to do unpleasant things to him. The main thing is stopping his attack. Personally, I thrust, but that's kind of about where I'm from. So in left ox, your forearms don't need to cross. Like that. Yeah. You want it high enough that you're not going to get hit if he does the scalper. Yeah, so that sort of position, Rebecca. And we'll get onto the scalper in just a second or two or 20. So the second one is plow, Pflug. Meyer forms this very differently to the earlier longsword masters. The earlier longsword masters, the sword is back on the hip. So if I can partially stand, sort of there, guarding in. Meyer throws himself a lot further forward, and again, you can form it left or right according to which foot is forward. Your hilt is by your forward knee, pointy end is at the other guy's face. And this is primarily to guard your lower body. And because you are forward, you can actually swing your hilt past your knee. So just by slightly raising it, and take it as if it were a rapier left and right of your forward knee to catch low cuts or thrusts and divert them. And then again, do whatever form of unpleasantness you like to your opponent. Again, this is one he's different. So this is Tag. Early ones have von Tag or von Tag. They are more kind of like your classic samurai position, with it at the shoulder, vertically up, hilt at about the level of the top of the head or slightly lower. Meyer, you've got this far more central position, right over the head. He describes it solely with the left foot forward. I see absolutely no reason you couldn't do it right foot forward with a view to, you know, biomechanics going the other way. Yes, please stab me in the stomach position. Yeah, you probably don't want to do that against somebody in this guard. It will end poorly. So you kind of think of this as quite an aggressive guard, you know, come and have a go. It gets more aggressive. As mentioned, this is a manly sport for manly German men. Meyer is very dismissive of Olber, the fool. He says you are a fool to get stuck in this position, or words to that effect. So left foot forward, point extended down towards the ground in front of the forward foot. However, firstly, this is where you end up if you're doing a straight downwards cut, if you don't divert it. Secondly, it is the work of a moment, if somebody advances while you're in this position, for you to push your left pommel hand downwards, bringing the point flicking straight back upwards, either as a cut to somewhere incredibly uncomfortable, or as a, hey, look, you just walked into my longsword moment. So my personal view is the older masters didn't view the fool in this as being the person in it. It is an opportunity for somebody else to be made into a fool. But Meyer doesn't have a thrust, so you have limited options from this position if you're playing his game. And probably you want to just be passing through. So yeah, I said it got more aggressive, didn't I? This is Zornhut, the Roth Guard. So he's left foot forward. The sword is cocked all the way around back behind the body. This is telegraphing what's called the Roth stroke, which is that incredibly powerful diagonal downward stroke from your dominant side towards your non-dominant side. Incredibly powerful, particularly as you will follow the sword through and step through with that. So you've got your body weight and all of the big muscles of your back adding to it. However, just because that is the obvious thing to do from that position does not mean that it is the only or indeed the correct thing to do from that position. And we'll get a little bit more onto that when we move on to the cuts. Long point, Langnot. So this is the classic example of a guard which is not a guard. This is a position you pass through when you are doing pretty much any cut or thrust. Okay, your sword is out extended in front of you towards the other guy, and if you continue on through this, it implies you've missed. The astute observer will notice that this chap has a cross of Lorraine across him. These are defining the directions of cuts which can be done to him. So you have a diagonally downwards to the head on both sides, a diagonally upwards to the head, a diagonally downwards to the body on either side, a horizontal to the body on the other side, a diagonally upwards on either side, and a straight upwards and straight downwards. Fighting dogs are optional. Again, this is a guard you pass through rather than one you stay in, so change. So you've done your big Roth stroke down, you've ended up right foot forward and sword down there. So true edge is down here, short edge, sorry, long edge is down there, short edge is down there, pointing towards your opponent. And this is a position you're going to be leaving quite quickly if you know what's good for you. Couldn't find a nice picture in his printed book, but this is from the manuscript, the Lund manuscript. The chap in red is in Nebenhut, side guard, where, oh no, he's not actually, he's in change, because he should have his left foot forward. Oh well, never mind. However, the short edge is towards him, which is why it's different to change. And as you can see, he is seriously twisted up and is about to have a bad day, as his opponent is using his longsword as a lever to make him fall over. This is Iron Gate, Eisenport. Those of you who are paying attention will notice this is not a longsword. This is rapier and cloak. He hasn't got a nice picture of it. However, as his left hand wrapped 3 times in the cloak is held close to the sword hand, the position would be very similar with a longsword. And of course, we know why you don't leave a big gap between the cloak hand and the sword hand, don't we, Fardang? You're still muted.
I know now, by bad experience.
Yeah. So it's a bit further forward than your plough. The hilt is all the way forward of the knee, and it's held a little bit more with the arms extended. You don't have to put on 16th century cosplay of Roman gear unless you really want to. Let's just do a little pause to look at the... oh, yes, you're quite right. Roman kit with big trousers. I think I've answered what's the difference between Iron Gate and plough. You're a bit further forward. Yeah, big trousers do indeed make everything better. If you take nothing else from this class, take away that big trousers make everything better. Crossed guard, Schrankenhut. I don't think I've ever deliberately been in this position. It is just begging for somebody to grab hold of your right shoulder or sleeve and pull, and all sorts of unpleasantness will occur. It's potentially guard against a low cut, but in that situation, you're probably going to be better pulling your foot back and doing something very unpleasant to their head, because Pythagoras, you know, the diagonal for him to attempt to hit your leg is going to be longer than the straight line for you to hit him in the head. So realistically, you're going to end up there as the end of a cut. Hanging point is a bit more practical. Right foot forward, arms extended in front. Meyer actually says but further forward than it shows you in the picture. So clearly the engraver and model didn't please him in this one. So you need to have that slightly more forward against the body. Again, this is largely defensive initially, but then you can either thrust or launch cuts from there. And Schlüssel, the key. So this is the funky one where you rest your sword on your own arm and point it at the other guy. It's quite comfortable. I'm not entirely sure what it's for beyond that. Unicorn looks like this. Unlike plow, the point is pointing upwards rather than towards your opponent's face. So it's diagonal upwards rather than a slight diagonal downwards. Otherwise, very similar. Now, having got through those guards, honestly, you need Targ, you need both the oxes, you need plow and or iron gate, and you need fool. And the rest are positions you will inevitably end up in, and if you want to give them a name, great, they've got one. So if you were to start in Targ and do a straight cut down, this is Meyer's cut diagram. If you thought about the positions you would go, so you start way up here and you step through while cutting down. At midpoint, as you go through the center of the cut diagram, you are in long point. And you will then end up down here in fool, unless you divert down on one of the obliques. The Roth Cut, that great big coiled up aggressive thing, actually, as it's drawn, goes from B. Yes, the text in the diagram was wrong. The diagram is right. So you can see Zorn, okay, Roth goes from B to F. So ignore where I've said H to D. So you start in your Roth Guard, you go through long point, and you end in change. From there, you can flick it back up, going back through long point, and you end up in unicorn. Okay. Now, looking at things with names, there is a high cut, which is the A to E line. The middle cut, which is G to C or C to G. And he describes the Unterhau as being a cut from F to B up into right ox. There's no reason you couldn't do it up into left ox and end up the other way round. It's just which oblique you take. Okay. Any questions? No. Okay. So it's a very different way of thinking about it. So this is where you start thinking about your flick book analog, your cartoon of cutting through the various positions. However, I said before, I go back to some of the older books where they talk about master cuts, and Meyer mentions them all. He kind of jumbles them more in with the standard cuts, and they are quite useful in and of themselves. The Roth Cut, the Zornhau we've talked about already, it's this big diagonal woodcutter's chop. You're telegraphing it for miles. So you can totally divert it to other places. So rather than following through down there, you can flick up into left ox and do the cut using a lot of that speed that you've built up, but on the exact 90-degree oblique angle. Okay, does that kind of make sense? You're setting somebody up to expect something and then doing something different. Yeah. I can see Rebecca lining up a Mittelhau there. The crooked cut is a little bit more subtle. Now, you start in your Roth Guard and you let the other guy, because you're hurrying him, okay, you're making him want to attack you before you can unleash this blow of doom. Because, I mean, Roth is a pretty difficult position to defend yourself in. So when he cuts at you, you step hard outwards with your right foot. Okay, so you are stepping from the left foot forward position that Mr. Pink here has been in, out way to the side, so that the other guy's attack misses you. And you are turning your hands like that. Yeah, not hitting your wife for preference, okay? And that combined with the big step you've taken sideways means your sword is going to be coming in at 90 degrees to where it should be. Now, in this position, he's used it to strike the opponent's blade to bear it down. Great. Okay. Personally, I aim about there. And if you are very lucky with your positioning, you can take out both arms with a single shot. And it looks quite cool, which, let's face it, is important. Oh, sorry. So the thwart. This is for when other people are attacking you again, because you're starting in Roth, you are going, ooh, attack me before I can really clobber you on. And as he attacks you, you cut into his cut, rolling your hands to use the short edge, I would suggest after contact. So you contact with the long edge and then roll over into ox. He's gone the other side. So into ox. Okay. And at the same time, you step right. Okay. I had a play with this 2 nights ago, and my wrist tendonitis has settled because I didn't read the bit about set your right foot to his left side. Your wrist gets really unhappy if you try this without the footwork. Okay, so you need to step hard to the other side. It's a left ox, Rebecca. Yeah. Okay, so you cut into him and then you step round and roll into ox. Yeah. And that brings the tip of your sword round into his face. Yeah. Okay. So basically you're cutting from Roth into left ox through his sword and into his face. Okay. But if you try this without moving your feet, it's really unpleasant for your wrists. And then we move on to the squinter, the Schielhau. I am aware of at least 4 different interpretations of this stroke, depending on which particular German manual you have been reading. Meyer lists 2 of them. And from his interpretations, I can think of at least 2 ways to do it. And I'm not sure which is right. So anyway, what he says, you start in day or Roth with your left foot forward. When he cuts at you, you'll notice incidentally that Meyer had been encouraging you to grab the 4, yeah? So all of this, when he attacks you stuff, implies you're already doing it wrong, because you're supposed to be hitting him first. Anyway, when he cuts at you, you again cut in return, and again, I think you are connecting with the long edge, and then as you take your step with your right foot towards your right, his left, you're striking him with the short edge. So you are taking a diagonal right forward step and therefore angling in. And by using the short edge, so if you flick into right ox almost, right ox, yeah, you see your blade angles in. Okay, so that's one of the interpretations. This is a literal copy paste of what he says. As he strikes, position yourself as if you mean to strike in together with him, but don't. Rather turn your sword in the air so that your hands come crosswise and cut with crossed hands and the half edge, short edge, together with him from above in against his right. Okay, or goes without, so his blade also comes against his right or goes without hitting besides your right, and step well with your left foot on his right side. So that's totally clear, isn't it? Yeah. And you may boggle slightly. This is one of the clearer explanations of the squinter. Okay. So what I think is you start in Roth. As he starts cutting towards you, you go into a cut yourself. Now, you either let the blades clash, let your wrist go soft so his sword is pushing yours down, and take a big step round to your left with your left foot and into right ox, which will clobber him on the side of the head with your short edge. Okay, so step right, clash, twist, and thump. Okay, that's what I think it is. But just rereading this for the class, I wonder from this wording, which is partly from the Lund manuscript, whether he actually means when you are coming down from Roth, don't clash and instead duck his stroke, swinging your sword round over your head to guard it, and still, duck the blow, taking the left-hand step to lower your body, and still end up in right ox, hitting him on the side of the head. I'm not sure. If you're doing it that way, you've got to land your right foot early in the cut. Normally, you want your foot to land at the point your blade lands. So you would start, land the right foot, sudden flick over to the left. Okay. Play with it. Have fun. Tell me which one works better. Because every time I have interpreted this, I have come up with a different explanation. And Paul de Gory has been looking at this for at least 25 years and still isn't 100% sure about the squinter. He's been looking at older books. And the other possibility is they are talking about different things. And Meyer seems to acknowledge this because he talks about an old squinter and a new squinter. So he is aware there are at least two different blows being called the same thing. Anyway, let's move on to something nice and easy in comparison to the squinter. The scalp cut. Now, Meyer lists this as just a different name for the high cut. However, if you look at the older books, this is one of the master strokes. And chopping directly down from above your head to ankle height is not particularly masterly. There is a thing you can do. Okay, so you cut into your opponent. Being a good German, he either cuts into you or he goes into crown to try and parry it. You then lift your wrists like that. You can see just very faintly, he is dropping his wrists just very slightly. And by changing, I don't know how that keeps going forward one. By just going very slightly forward, you are angling your sword back round using his parry as a pivot. It's not going to hit very hard. But if you're hitting the scalp, so you go down and then at the last bit, you push your elbows up and your wrists slightly down. Okay, this may be one where I've got an advantage because my elbows do actually go past straight. So you are using his crown parry as a pivot and go past it down onto the top of his head. Okay, almost like fly fishing, I guess. So chop. Oh, up. Okay. I'm seeing puzzled expressions on that one. Let's check the... yes, scalp wounds do bleed like swamps. And yeah. Right. So... I assume the yes, please don't do that was hitting my wife with a longsword. Right. So let's open the mics. This is really difficult to teach. Actually, if you look at Target Boy here, you can see he is pushing that left hand up slightly in comparison to bring the tip of the longsword down. So that's a way you can do it as well. Okay, as you connect, if you push your pommel hand upwards, it will bring the tip down, and you can pivot round the parry to just do a quick clunk to them. So, any questions? Or have I stunned you all? Some typed ones. Let's just see. Yes, His Majesty points out that it's easier to do if you relax your right hand a bit. Absolutely. I'm not sure I follow, Rebecca. Do you want to just explain what you mean there?
Yeah, I can try. Hang on, so I'll try and actually show it. So
Yeah.
if I'm like extending my arm like this, you can see the creases here.
Yeah.
And then when I straighten it, it goes to there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Please don't play too much with your hypermobility.
Yeah,
I'm a very concerned physiotherapist right now.
So
I would say
Stop
that's
it.
perfectly normal behavior for a female elbow.
It literally is like I can't fully straighten my arm without that happening.
I wouldn't necessarily say hyperextension is a boon to this sport. Quite
no,
the opposite.
it's not great for the knees, certainly.
Yeah, it's like when someone pointed out that like that's hypermobility and it's not normal and potentially a problem, I was like, oh, is that also why sometimes I feel like my knees are turning inside out?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Oh, good.
Now, having got all that, Meyer describes a lot of what can you do from X-Guard stuff. And that would be incredibly tedious to go through in a PowerPoint. So I haven't. He does a few stepped through plays, which would actually make quite nice training exercises. And I may sit down at some point to write them out in modern, as it were, for people to walk through. He does a lot of them with things like quarterstaff or spear or halberd. There's some you look at and go, well, what on earth is he talking about here? And the terrifying thing is you hand that to, for example, Elfin, and he goes, well, I'm clearly just clobbering that guy. Then as I flick back into that position, I'm hitting that guy. And then my third move will hit that guy. And you just go, okay, Elfin. That was a longsword one. That was a little bit scary because Meyer doesn't talk about it in those terms. But there's also there's one of his halberd moves where we went, look, I just don't understand that. And we walked through it at Raglan. And then we got somebody to walk through it again with 3 people holding spears in front of them. And it utterly disrupted a spear line. Utterly. It was clearly a halberd anti-pike maneuver. And, one spear was up there and the other 2 were tangled down there with a person-shaped hole in the middle. So stuff's there. There's moves in quarterstaff which directly translate to SCA spear, going on guard in pretty much in Targ with the spear, and then doing these incredibly strong beats downwards onto the other guy's hand, and then using the rebound upwards from that beat to bounce into his face or upper torso. I would suggest in SEA Heavy, doing that to somebody's hand is probably unsporting, but doing it to their spear is right on. You also can't gauge distance on a spear that is being held vertically. So you can't use it as a guide of measure, for example. So any other questions? I know I'm early, but any takers?
You're so well behaved.
I know, it's a bit disappointing, really. You know, I was hoping for the fighting dogs.
I'm just a bit curious about, was it Peter Alrune who put out something about the thrust in Meyer?
Yeah,
I haven't read the comment through yet.
Yeah, I glanced at that. I think that's a reach. Meyer inserts it back in for the rapier. But I think it's a reach to talk about it for Meyer's longsword. However, if you read Meyer alongside any of the earlier longsword traditions, you can see the points at which you would have thrust it. And to be honest, quite often it's blatantly obvious when you'd have thrust normally. So I don't agree, but I think it's very easy to reintegrate.
I think you should read the long section because it's a very good discussion on why Meyer should be a proponent of thrusting, not an opponent of thrusting. So read the whole thing. It's very, very long, but it's a very good, and it has a lot of cites from the sources where we talk about thrusts, even in the longsword part. So yeah, it has been a long, long discussion in the HEMA world about Meyer thrusts, but I think that the common stance now is yes, thrust is okay, actually, and especially in war.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that meets either what's said in the text or the context of the period for 1570. You know, if you are practicing thrusts with weapons in the fencing style, I think you are traditionally using buttoned weapons. I seem to recall seeing some illustrations, and I honestly can't remember where, of ones with little bags tied around the end of the tip. And you don't see that with the feathers in Meyer. But also, by 1570, longsword is obsolete for war. I can't think of anybody using, you know, spadoni or you know, any of the two-handed swords that late. I don't know, Alexander or Fardang. Can you think of any?
no one comes to mind that late.
Yeah.
We have to go back a couple of decades.
Yeah. And I mean, so I don't think thrusting fits the context for Meyer. I think it's very easy to do if you wanna, and if it were a real fight, heck, of course, yes, you would. But in a sporting setting, you don't want to break your friends. And they didn't do this with masks on. And, you know, it's all fun and games till somebody loses an eye. So.
And then it's fun and games until someone loses the other eye.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, no, your stereotypical Prussian nobleman, that's a completely different thing. So mensur fencing is this peculiarly German thing where you basically have your feet nailed to the floor. Sorry, you're not allowed to move your feet. You're not allowed to do a straight parry. You're allowed to cut into the other guy's cuts, but you're not allowed to sort of purely defend. And you wear a particular sort of fencing mask that protects your nose and your eyes, but leaves your temples and your cheeks exposed. You do this at university. A certain amount of alcohol is involved, and you have a limited number of fights in which you gain your scars. They did things like stitching horse hairs into the scars in the 19th and early 20th century to ensure that they scarred impressively, because of course you would. It's still done, but they do it with different shape protection now, I think, so that the scars are in more concealed locations. That said, I went to a fencing event in Germany. Now, this was before the days of good simulators for heavy rapier, but we did have the practice mensur blades, Schlägers. So we, wheeled my swords into the check-in desk, and the check-in lady said, you have enjoyed your golf, doctor. And I went, well, it's not golf, it's swords. And she clearly didn't know the English word sword, and I couldn't remember the word Schwert, meaning sword in German. So I said Schläger, and she sort of paused and then leaned over the desk and to one side and then to the other side to check out my cheeks and temples. And I sort of realized what was going on and just said, no, you see, I'm just very, very good at it. So yeah, German academic fencing is something completely different that you wouldn't get me anywhere near for an awful lot of money. Yes, Rebecca.
Also an actual question. I've got one of the Meyer books. It's
That's the Lund manuscript.
Yeah.
The other one.
Yeah, I think you held it out. It's just like The Art of Combat.
Yeah, that's that one, which is the printed one.
Okay.
You can get them for about between 15 and 20 quid. The Art of Sword Combat is currently out of print, but is being reprinted by the look of things at the end of this month, and is available on Kindle anyway for not very much. I did have it in hard copy. I still do somewhere, but there was a heavy rain at Raglan one year, and it, along with my hard copy of that, is feeling a little bit sorry for itself, slightly warped and foxed. So, oops.
Slightly foxed and extremely dragoned.
Indeed.
But what I was going to ask was, what is the best way of dealing with this? Is it just like start at the beginning and follow the instructions?
Yes, I think so. I've been a very bad example for that, because I seriously lack the patience to work through it in order the way you're supposed to. But yes, I would. That's partly
yeah, it's the kind of open just went, what? And
yeah, the printed one is significantly easier reading than the manuscript one. The manuscript one is not a finished work. It's got better, prettier pictures, but it's not actually as good an instruction book. So what we have done with Elfin is Elfin has one fencing authorization, and it is cut and thrust longsword. In due course, he will get cut and thrust single sword for Messer, and it's actually Dusak in the book, but that's a wood and leather training version of a long knife, Messer in German, and then, you know, rapier and secondary. So Meyer's rapier talks about a variety of things. I've raided the cloak section as those of you who have attended my cloak class will remember, Meyer's guard of extreme casualness, where you have the sword by your side pointing down towards the ground and the cloak hanging loose by your other side, and you are completely open. It's in the other book. And as your opponent cuts towards your upper torso, which is totally the invitation, you swing the cloak up, knock his sword out of the way, and come round the outside with a cut to his head. It's really showy, and I would not bet my life on it in the slightest, but it looks very cool. Most of his work is using the cloak as a cloth forearm guard for you to deflect blows onto. So you parry, pick it up with your forearm, and then do something unpleasant. So anyway, that's digressing. So yeah, I would work through it, and I'd work through the printed one, but you can have great fun picking up sections of it, like the spear or halberd, and just reading his instructions out while somebody else performs them, and then working out what it's for. Josephine's hand is up.
Hi, Rebecca. I don't know where you're from, or
North of England.
North of England, sorry. Are you set on Meyer? Because if you want to start with longsword, I would really recommend you to go to YouTube. There are loads of instructive videos, and one of the really good ones that actually following Döbringer's manuscript that really helped me in the beginning, because I have a bit of a problem learning this stuff from the books. I really like to try them out and watch it played, so to speak. And I would really recommend you to check out Sword Carolina if you're not totally set on just learning the Meyer manuscript.
I am a huge magpie and pick up things from all sorts of places. But I haven't come across Sword Carolina, so
they're really good. They're actually they did a series from the Döbinger manuscript a couple of years ago, and now they have like done corrections from that video, but I would really, it's really informative and they're really good pacing, going through the different guards, principles, and cuts. So if you're into German longsword, I would really recommend you to check out Sword Carolina's Döbinger lessons, because they're really good and like a good place to start if you're on your own.
Okay. Any more takers? Okie dokie. Well, yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you for giving the class.
Thank you.
Mm.
So it's fun to see the